Chicago, 1868. Smoke from the locomotives rose thick over the tracks of the Prescott and Northern Railway's main yard, staining the sky in shades of copper and rust. From the upper glass gallery, tall windows, cold, practical, nothing lavish, Margaret Prescott watched the brutal dance of men and machines moving to the rhythm she herself enforced. On the mahogany table, the railway maps sprawled like open veins across the continent, red lines linking Chicago to New Orleans, others, in charcoal, pushing westward into the untamed frontier, creeping dangerously close to the Rocky Mountains. Every stroke marked a choice, a gamble, a night lost to worry. At 25, with 5 suitors refused, Margaret had learned to recognize the same smile in all of them. Polite, patronizing, calculated. They came to offer help, as if the railroad weighed too heavily on a woman's hands. None understood that she was not looking to be rescued. She was looking for an equal. Her reflection on the glass returned the image of a young woman society did not know where to place, a dark brown wool dress, high collar, hair swept into a severe bun. No lace, no feathers. Silk, she had learned early, only gave men an excuse to treat her as decoration rather than a business partner. A whistle echoed from below. The 5 o'clock train was leaving right on time. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the faint tremor of the machines beneath her feet, the living pulse of the company her father had entrusted to her far too soon, and which she had expanded through sheer stubbornness and meticulous calculation to the very edge of possibility. It was in that quiet between one whistle and the next that the telegraph operator knocked at her door. "Miss Prescott," his voice wavered, "there's a British attorney waiting in your office, says the matter is urgent." Margaret opened her eyes. The October wind slipped through the window's narrow gap, carrying the smell of coal and something else, promise perhaps, or warning. A letter awaited her on the desk when she entered the main office. Thick envelope, fine paper, a New York seal, firm handwriting. Lennox and Ward, solicitors. Subject, proposal of matrimonial union. She did not sit. She broke the seal with her thumb, her stomach tightening in reluctant anticipation. Lord William Hawthorne, Duke of Silvermont, presently residing in America due to unforeseen financial difficulties, expresses formal interest in a matrimonial union. His Grace is unable to return to England until certain obligations are settled. He is prepared to negotiate terms compatible with his station. No declarations of passion, no sentimental flourishes. A marriage proposal written with the clean detachment of a business contract. Margaret read it again, slowly, as if the words might rearrange themselves and reveal whatever truth lay behind the polished veneer. A duke, ruined, exiled, a man who had lost everything, and who still dared to be so direct. A flicker of memory crossed her mind. Her father, Connor Prescott, an Irish visionary with large hands scarred by winter on the rails, telling her, back when she could barely reach the drafting table, "Never trust someone who wraps everything in sugar, Maggie. What's solid comes raw, almost rough, but it holds." She folded the letter and walked to the window. Below, Chicago rose on scaffolds, hammer strikes, and new brick structures. The city grew too fast to recognize itself in the mirror. Much like her. Daughter of an immigrant who had turned a local line into the backbone of the American interior, motherless since 11, responsible for the company's operations at 23 when an industrial accident took her younger brother, George, and nearly shattered her father for good. While other girls practiced embroidery, Margaret memorized roots. While young ladies played piano in bright salons, she trudged through mud during track inspections, boots sinking as she measured the strength of newly built bridges. After George's death, the work stopped being a vocation. It became a wall. Chicago loved her and feared her in equal measure. Matrons whispered about her eccentricity, but still invited her to their dinners, knowing it was unwise to ignore a Prescott. Businessmen praised her efficiency, though none ever invited her into the clubs where the real deals were struck after the 3rd glass of whiskey. 5 suitors had sat across from her. 5 men who saw not a woman, but a golden opportunity. Railway fortune, political influence, lucrative contracts, all promised to help her carry the burden, None asked whether she considered it a burden at all. None asked whether she wished to share it. Margaret brushed her thumb across the envelope once more. Perhaps a ruined duke, at least, could be honest about his ruin. Perhaps a man who had already lost everything might understand the worth of what she had built. Or perhaps he was simply another suitor, this one with a British accent and an empty title. She pulled a sheet of Prescott and Northern letterhead, dipped her pen in ink, and began to write. The words flowed steady and firm, without flourish. If Lord Hawthorne wishes to discuss terms, he may come to Chicago. I do not rely on intermediaries for decisions that affect my life or my company. When she finished, she dried the ink, folded the reply, and rang the bell. "Send it to New York today," she ordered. "Urgent wire." When the messenger left, Margaret returned to the window. The tracks vanished into the horizon, swallowed by fog and smoke. Perhaps it was time to learn whether a fallen duke could offer more truth than the magnates still climbing toward their thrones. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. It helps the channel continue bringing new tales to life. And now, please enjoy the rest of the story. Chapter 1. A Woman's Proposal. Margaret had not expected him to be young. When William Hawthorne stepped into the Prescott and Northern Railway office on a sharp November morning, she was standing by the window, reviewing expansion reports for the Dakota Territory. A thin draft slipped through the pane and brushed the back of her neck, reminding her that winter was closing in, and frozen tracks forgave nothing. She heard the door open, but didn't turn. A habit inherited from Connor Prescott. Men reveal more when they think you're not looking, Maggie. Let them believe that for a few seconds. His footsteps were steady, controlled. No nervous clearing of the throat, no shuffling. He entered and simply waited. Margaret counted to 10 before turning slowly. The first impression was height. William Hawthorne stood taller than any suitor before him, and unlike most, he didn't try to exaggerate it with some stiff military posture. His dark attire was impeccable, his wool overcoat unmistakably English, its quiet quality at odds with the fatigue etched across his face. Dark brown hair combed back, a sharply cut jaw, and eyes caught somewhere between green and amber, watching her with calm, almost clinical attention. 30, perhaps a little older, far too young to look that worn. "Miss Prescott." His voice carried the British accent so many Americans found refined. To her it was simply another timbre, and surprisingly honest. "Thank you for receiving me." Margaret inclined her head. "Lord Hawthorne." She motioned toward the chairs with her chin. "Sit." He didn't choose the armchair reserved for important visitors. Instead, he took the work chair. A small detail, but telling. Perhaps humility. Perhaps calculation. She remained standing. "Your letter was direct," she began, folding her arms. "I appreciate that. So I'll be equally direct. I am not seeking a husband to manage my life or my company. I need neither financial protection nor an aristocratic name to validate my position." William didn't blink. "I understand." A muscle tightened at the base of her neck. Many said, "I understand," when what they truly meant was, "Just wait. I'll put you in your place soon enough." The 5 suitors before him had begun the same way. "I'm looking for someone who understands that marriage, for me, is a partnership, a business alliance. Not rescue, not social ornament." Silence settled between them. Below, a locomotive whistle sliced the air like an answer. "And you believe a ruined duke can offer that?" he asked. Not in irony, not in defense, simply curiosity. Margaret walked to the desk, resting her fingertips on the mahogany surface. For a moment, the memory of her father's trembling signature, granting her authority after George's death, cut through her thoughts. She drew a steady breath. "I believe a man who has lost much and remained standing is, at the very least, familiar with truth." His eyes searched hers. William leaned forward slightly, fingers interlaced over his knee. "Then you know my situation." "I know enough." She kept her voice neutral. She had paid dearly for discreet inquiries in New York. Inherited debts, a duel, estates used as collateral, voluntary exile. A fleeting smile touched his face, the first since he'd entered. Faint, melancholy, but sincere. "And still, here I am," he said, "in search of a mutually beneficial arrangement. You could have married any American heiress eager to display a European title." Margaret didn't soften the words. "There are dozens of them. Why didn't you?" He inhaled as if the question pulled forward memories he'd rather forget. "Because many wanted the myth of the charming Duke." One corner of his mouth twitched. "And all I have left is the title." Something shifted in Margaret's chest. Not attraction. Recognition. That unsettling moment when another voice speaks the truth you've lived. She, the brilliant heiress, sought for fortune, not for herself. She didn't let it reach her expression. "I have conditions," she said, returning to solid ground. "I assumed as much." He wasn't offended, not even eager, simply attentive. 3 months of work as a consultant for the Prescott and Northern, unpaid. She lifted her chin. "I need to see whether you understand business, or only claim to. At the end of that period, if I judge that you possess real competence, we will discuss an engagement." He didn't answer at once. William let his gaze travel across the room, the maps, the telegraph, the metal files, the deliberate absence of anything ornamental. She noticed the moment something in him shifted, genuine respect, touched by something that looked like envy or longing for something he had never possessed. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then we save each other time," she replied without blinking. For a moment she thought he would hesitate, perhaps make a clever remark, perhaps try to renegotiate. Instead, William rose slowly. He was tall enough to make her lift her chin. Usually that irritated her, but his presence didn't loom. It simply occupied space. "I accept your terms, Miss Prescott." A brief pause, as if he'd just made a larger decision than he intended to confess. "But I have a condition as well." A flicker of tension ran down her spine. She was used to men imposing terms, but not after admitting ruin. "What is it?" The question came sharper than she intended. "During these 3 months, I intend to observe you as well." His tone held no insinuation, no arrogance, just a strange calm, not only as a director, as a person. "If marriage is a partnership, I need to know the woman behind the business." The air seemed to grow heavier, not with threat, but with intensity. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, annoyed that her body would respond at all. Not to danger, but to exposure. "That wasn't part of the agreement," she said coolly. "It was implied." He stepped back, giving her space, a simple gesture that said, "I see you. I won't push where I'm not welcome. You wish to measure my competence? Fair. But I won't bind myself only to the director of Prescott and Northern. I need to understand Margaret, the woman." Her name in his voice sounded different, less formal, almost intimate, even though the distance between them remained unbroken. She wanted to refuse, to remind him that her personal life was not up for negotiation, that she had already lost a brother, nearly lost her father, and did not intend to hand over what was left of herself to the judgment of a bankrupt Englishman. But William watched her with worn honesty, no shine, no glamour. A man who had little to offer beyond truth and the willingness to work. And Margaret was tired of men who glittered on the outside and rotted underneath. "Very well," she said at last. 3 months. Mutual evaluation. His lips drew the hint of a smile, a small, grateful gesture, free of triumph. William extended his hand. "Agreement made." She looked at it for a heartbeat. It was not soft, like the hands of bankers who never braved the cold. There were marks there, faint calluses hinting at a kind of labor titles, should have spared him. Margaret took his hand. The handshake was firm, unpretentious. When he left, the office felt smaller. The usual silence, instead of comforting, sounded unfamiliar. She returned to the window. Below, William Hawthorne crossed the rail yard between workers and machinery, slipping past men with natural ease, like someone accustomed to walking through worlds that didn't fully claim him. He stopped beside a freight car, asked the foreman a question, and listened to the answer with genuine attention. No theatrical arrogance, no pose, just quiet presence, observant and grounded. Margaret's lips curved, barely, a hint of a smile she would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Perhaps, just perhaps, this one was different. And if he wasn't, she would learn quickly. She always did. But for the first time in a long while, as she watched the tracks disappear into the horizon, Margaret's thoughts drifted away from numbers. She wondered what it might mean at last, not to stand quite so alone in that glass mezzanine. Chapter 2. The Weight of an Empty Title. William Hawthorne had not expected her to be frightening. Not the loud kind of fear, but the quiet sort that settles in when a man realizes, against his will, that someone can see through the layers he has spent years trying to protect. He was sitting in his newly assigned office, a narrow room with a window overlooking the yards, a plain pine desk, and the constant scent of grease when that realization took hold. Margaret Prescott was not radiant like the American heiresses who had circled him in New York, nor beautiful in the predictable ways of London's ballrooms, but there was something in her that disarmed him. Perhaps it was the way she stood before him, steady as the steel that powered her own company. Perhaps it was the cold precision with which she stated her terms, leaving no room for embellishment. Or worse, the moment her eyes met his, and William felt himself being evaluated the way an engineer evaluates a locomotive, layer by layer, without illusions. She had seen him exactly as he was, a man who had lost more than he dared admit. And yet, she had accepted the arrangement. William braced his elbows on the desk and rubbed his face. The fatigue he carried didn't come from a bad night's sleep. It came from the last few years. Years spent under the weight of poor decisions, mounting debts, and a title that had become a shackle instead of a shield. Since arriving in America, he had survived however he could. He had translated documents for hurried attorneys, done private consulting for European investors, even taught etiquette for an entire week to the daughters of a newly wealthy magnate. Nothing befitting the dignity of a duke, nothing that Eton or Oxford would consider remotely respectable. But losing ground was still better than losing the few ties he had left to the past. The duel, the memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. The damp field in Surrey at dawn, the metallic scent of the weapon, Christopher Dane's feverish words echoing through the trees. 2 shots, no deaths, but reputations torn apart, rumors ablaze, an entire family dragged into a scandal too wide to contain. His father fell ill. Creditors tightened their grip, and William, to salvage whatever remained, accepted what London politely called voluntary exile. He exhaled slowly and pulled closer the report Margaret had handed him that morning. It was a quarterly analysis of the Chicago-Omaha line. The notes in the margins were unmistakably hers, firm handwriting, clipped without an ounce of sentiment. Review conductors. Maintenance cost above projection, investigate. Sullivan is right about the valve issue. William read, then reread, then allowed himself to admit that her mind was remarkable. She saw what most administrators ignored for convenience's sake. 3 hours later, when the late afternoon light slanted through the narrow window, he had to stand. His eyes burned. He stepped closer to the window and saw her. Margaret walked beside a chief engineer, studying drawings as she gestured with one hand, coat sleeves pushed up to mid-forearm, posture straight, presence undeniable. The engineer, a large, proud man, bent toward her with genuine respect. No one seemed surprised to see her in the yards. She belonged to that world of tracks, steam, and hard decisions, far more than she had ever belonged to any ballroom or social gathering. A tightness rose in William's chest. Not admiration, not yet. Respect. And beneath it a flicker of bitter envy. She had built something that belonged to her. He had inherited only ruins. A sharp knock broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Harrison, the supervisor who'd accompanied him earlier, entered carrying a folder. "Miss Prescott asked me to deliver the locomotive maintenance logs," he said, setting them on the desk. "She said if you plan on giving opinions about finances, you ought to understand what keeps the tracks running." William nodded. "Thank you." But Harrison didn't leave. The supervisor crossed his arms, studying him with that straightforward American gaze, blunt, unapologetic. "Mind if I ask something, Mill—" Harrison stopped himself. William lifted a hand. "You may call me William." A small smile tugged beneath the man's graying mustache. "All right then, William." He scratched the back of his neck. "Do you actually know anything about railroads? Or are you just trying to impress Miss Prescott?" The question came raw but honest, a trap either way. Arrogance would make him a fool. Modesty would make him weak. William chose the only path left to him. "No, I don't know railroads." He didn't look away. "But I know men and risks and systems that look solid until the exact moment they break." He drew a slow breath. "I spent years trying to keep my family from collapsing. I failed. But I learned enough to recognize fractures, even when they're small." Harrison regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. At least you're not pretending." He turned toward the door, then paused, hand on the knob. "Miss Prescott is the smartest person I know, and maybe the loneliest too." William went still. "Every man who's walked through that door tried to use her as a shortcut to money or influence," Harrison continued. "None of them ever saw her for real. She's giving you a chance." His gaze hardened. "Don't waste it." The door closed. Silence returned. Heavy. Close. William braced his hands on the desk, breathing slowly. He hadn't expected those words, and even less, the weight they left behind. He moved back to the window. Margaret was no longer in the yard. Maybe back in her office. Maybe in a meeting. Perhaps, at that very moment, making decisions that would shape the next 5 years of the company. Whatever she was doing, he knew it wouldn't be superficial. Something in her worked like a well-tuned mechanism, always turning, always calculating, always carrying more weight than she should. And what broke her? The question surfaced before he could stop it. William reached for Harrison's folders. Diagrams, costs, worker notes, numbers that at first glance seemed scattered, but patterns emerged, tiny failures accumulating, invisible wear, money slipping through cracks no one had noticed. When he took a blank sheet and began sketching his own outline of a solution, he realized with discomfort and relief that it was the first time in months his mind felt as sharp as it once had, before the disaster. Outside, night settled over Chicago. Lamplights flickered on one by one. The locomotives whistled like breathing beasts in the dark. William lit the oil lamp, arranged the papers, and straightened his shoulders. 3 months, 90 days, to prove he was still worth something. And to learn whether this frightening, brilliant woman, with her high walls and eyes that saw far too much, might someday become someone he could trust, or whether the two of them were unknowingly building the foundations of an inevitable fracture. Chapter 3. Unexpected Observations. Margaret had not expected him to show up in the yards before dawn. That hour, 5:30 in the morning, when the city still breathed slowly beneath a veil of fog, was her private territory. The night shift gathered their tools. Half-asleep locomotives released lazy puffs of steam, and the heavy noise of the world had yet to wake. There, among damp rails and the metallic scent of machinery, she existed without being watched, without measuring her words or her posture. But on that cold December morning, as she descended the staircase to the main yard, she saw something that halted her step. William Hawthorne was there. The ruined Duke, coatless, sleeves rolled up, shirt smudged with grease, was speaking with Sullivan, the chief mechanic. White steam rose from the boiler under maintenance, curling around them like living fog, lit by the pale glow of the yard lamps. Margaret stopped in the shadow of a freight car unseen. William listened to Sullivan with steady attention, head slightly lowered, posture carrying neither arrogance nor submission. He asked precise, concise questions. Now and then, he repeated Sullivan's explanation in the air with one raised finger, as though determined to understand it fully. What crossed her chest was not admiration. It was discomfort. She had prepared defenses against aristocratic charm, calculated smiles, polished speeches. She was ready for ambition disguised as courtesy. But she had not prepared to find him like this, willing to learn, willing to get dirty. "Miss Prescott." Sullivan's deep voice pulled her out of the shadows. "Didn't know you were here already." William turned at once. His amber eyes found hers through the drifting steam. For a heartbeat, neither spoke, a brief, silent shock, as though both had been caught inside a thought they weren't supposed to have. Margaret stepped forward, her strides firm. "Trouble with the valve?" she asked Sullivan, deliberately professional. "Nothing serious." Sullivan wiped his hands on a rag. "I was showing Mr. Hawthorne how we spot wear before it turns into a real failure." She turned to William. "And learned anything useful?" He discreetly brushed a streak of grease from his wrist, a simple gesture, yet surprising. Men of his station usually avoided any contact with machinery. "I learned that each locomotive has its own personality," he replied. "Sullivan can tell which one is entering the yard just by the sound." A pause. "And I learned that you all treat that as a kind of language." Sullivan smiled, proud. Margaret kept her expression neutral. "And what does that have to do with financial consulting?" William didn't flinch. "Everything. Your reports show that some locomotives cost 3 times more in maintenance than others. If each one has particularities, imposing the same inspection pattern on all of them is waste." She hadn't expected him to be so quick. "And how do you plan to fix that?" she asked, lifting a brow. "Records," he answered instantly, almost sharp. "Every mechanic documents each machine's quirks. We turn instinct into method and cut costs." Sullivan nodded, impressed. Margaret felt the unease deepen. The irritation was thin, not because the idea was flawed, it was excellent, but because she had tried to explain that exact point to the board months earlier, only to be interrupted by men who called her alarmist. Watching William reach the same conclusion in just 2 weeks stirred something inside her, something she did not want to name or examine. "Simple," she said, "and effective." But her voice came out quieter than intended. Sullivan went off to fetch more men, leaving them alone. The yard was beginning to wake, steam thinning, rails gleaming under the first stretch of morning light. William watched her, but not with the familiar male gaze she knew so well, the one that measured, judged, or desired. It was another kind of gaze, more dangerous, one that tried to understand. "Why are you here so early?" she asked, attempting to regain control of the moment. "Reports tell me what happened," he said, "but men and machines tell me why." She almost smiled. Almost. "A curious philosophy for someone raised among horses and English titles," she teased. A small smile, the first genuine one he'd offered, touched his face. "Country estates have workers and machinery too. I should have listened more to the farm steward and less to my father's accountants. Maybe—" He stopped. "Maybe I would have avoided certain losses." The word losses slipped between them with a heavy, quiet weight. Margaret felt the question rising before she could stop it. "What did you lose?" William turned slightly toward the locomotive beside him. "Lands my family held for 200 years, the house where my mother grew up, the stables where I learned to ride." He ran his thumb across his palm, as if still feeling the grain of ancient wood. "Places hold the marks of the people who touched them. Losing them at once is like erasing generations." There was no self-pity in his voice, only truth. Margaret swallowed hard, because it sounded too familiar, because she too had lost a place that would never be rebuilt. "Your brother," William murmured, as though the conclusion had formed on its own. She froze. The morning cold suddenly felt too sharp. Her fingers tightened around her coat sleeve. "I don't discuss that," she whispered. William didn't step closer, didn't press, didn't offer comfort she hadn't asked for. Instead, he did something no man had done before. "I didn't ask you to," he said, voice quietly firm. "I just recognize loss when I see it. Sometimes that's enough." A thick silence fell between them, and for the first time, Margaret realized that this man, ruined, weary, out of place, saw her with a clarity that unsettled her deeply, because seeing too much was dangerous, because being recognized was worse. She stepped back. "I need to review contracts," she said, cutting the thread forming between them. "Margaret," he called, using only her name for the first time. She stopped, didn't turn. "Thank you," he said, "for—" letting me learn. A pause. I know trust isn't easy. Her heart jolted, unbidden, unwelcome. He saw her, and respected what he saw. I have work, she murmured, climbing the stairs. In her office, she went straight to the window. Below, William was speaking with Sullivan again, gesturing with his hands, leaning forward in full attention. Margaret pressed her palm to the cold glass. 2.5 months left. 80 days. But something was already happening. Something she hadn't planned for. Something she couldn't control. And deep down, that terrified her more than any runaway train ever could. Chapter 4. Invisible Fractures. William had not expected her to be so broken on the inside. 3 weeks had passed since his arrival, and the patterns were unmistakable. Margaret Prescott arrived before sunrise, left after the last locomotive fell silent, ate poorly, slept worse, worked as if every minute were a barricade, and never, ever allowed anyone to glimpse a single crack. But on that grey afternoon he saw one. He entered her office without knocking. An emergency on the Milwaukee line required immediate approval, and found Margaret standing by the window, holding a framed photograph in both hands. She hadn't heard him come in. Her shoulders, usually as unyielding as steel, were tense, curved in a way that did not belong to the implacable director of the Prescott and Northern. And her fingers trembled lightly against the glass. William stepped back instinctively, trying to leave without a sound. But the door creaked. Margaret turned sharply, almost violently. She hid the photograph behind her as if it were a weapon pointed at her chest. For a heartbeat, her eyes were unguarded, startled, wounded, human. Then the mask returned cold and immaculate. "You should have knocked." "My apologies," William said, keeping his distance. "There's an issue on the Milwaukee line. Morrison needs authorization to shut down operations for 6 hours. It's urgent." She set the frame on the shelf with abrupt speed, as if the object burned. "Approved," she said, not looking at him. "Double cruise. I want the line running before dusk." "Of course." William didn't move. "I'll relay the order." She remained silent. He should have left, but he couldn't. Something in the way she folded her arms across her chest, a small, almost invisible gesture, kept him rooted. "Was that your brother?" he asked. Her whole body stiffened. "That is none of your concern." "No," he agreed, "but perhaps it should be." Margaret shot him a look sharp enough to cut metal. "We are discussing railways, Lord Hawthorne, not my personal life." "We're discussing marriage," he corrected gently without raising his voice. "A marriage that requires knowing more than reports." That was the agreement. Silence. Not the quiet they had shared in the yards. A tense silence, full of unspoken questions neither dared shape aloud. Margaret seemed to weigh the cost of dismissing him, with words or with ice. But something in her shifted, subtle but real. She exhaled, slowly, like someone surrendering ground she had sworn never to yield. "George," she said at last, her voice too controlled to be natural. "My brother. He died 3 years ago during a night maneuver." The words were sharp, practiced, repeated so many times they had turned into something cold. "Crushed between 2 cars," she added, with the detachment of someone reciting a report. William did not say, "I'm sorry." He sensed that any automatic phrase would drive her behind another wall. "You don't believe it was an accident," he said. She hesitated, barely, almost imperceptibly, but enough. "The investigation concluded accident," she said, returning to her desk. "Case closed." "For them," William replied. "Not for you." The way she set her hands on the desk held something fractured, like she was holding back more than papers. "Enough. We have work. The Milwaukee line." "Can wait," he said, firm, but not harsh. 3 minutes won't compromise the railway." She lifted her gaze, surprised by the boundary he'd drawn. "Margaret," William continued, stepping closer but not touching the desk, "I'm not trying to intrude, but if we're evaluating a real union, I need to know what weighs on your soul. I cannot be partner to someone who carries everything alone until she breaks." Her eyes flashed, not with anger, but with fear thinly disguised. the same fear she'd buried for years. George was brilliant, she said, in a whisper too delicate for the woman who commanded hundreds of men. More than I was. He was developing a new signaling system. It would have cut accidents in half. Her hand tightened on the desk. It disrupted powerful interests. Interests with pockets far too deep. Her voice trembled at the edge of control and pain. And someone didn't want him to succeed, William finished softly. She closed her eyes for a second. I can't prove it. But you believe it. Margaret nodded, just a faint dip of the chin. I hired a private investigator, she went on. He found inconsistencies, strange timings, misplaced tools. Then he received threats and abandoned the case. My father begged me to stop. He was already sick. The company needed stability. Her voice broke just one fragile second. I stopped because I didn't have the strength to fight everything alone. Silence. Not the silence of anger, the silence of guilt. Guilt she had buried in work, in discipline, in walls built with precision. I carry too many shadows, she finished quietly. If that is a problem. It isn't a problem, William said, interrupting softly. It's a reason. She frowned. A reason. A reason to work until your body gives out. A reason to build walls. A reason to turn away 5 suitors. He drew a breath. You're not just running a company. You're protecting his legacy, trying to correct a wrong they never let you prove. Her eyes glinted, not with tears, but with something more dangerous, recognition. You don't know me well enough to judge my reasons, she said. Not yet, William admitted, but I know the weight of family. I carried mine too long. His voice dropped. I used my title as a cage, tried to save estates that were already dead, lost years trying to honor expectations that were never mine. Her defenses faltered, a thin crack, but a real one. Why are you telling me this? She asked. William smiled, a sad, gentle smile, vulnerable in the way only exhausted men can be. Because we are far too similar, he said, and that's frightening. But also strangely comforting. Margaret looked away, unable to bear the full truth of it. But when he turned to leave, her voice reached him. Soft, uncertain, as if it slipped out before she could stop it. William. He turned. And your ghosts? She asked. What do you intend to do with them, if we choose to move forward? It was a test, an invitation, a fear. William didn't hesitate. Bury them, he said. I can't change what I lost, but I can decide it won't command my future anymore. Perhaps you can too. She lifted her eyes. There was a fracture there, and through it a thread of light. Perhaps, she murmured. William left her office, closing the door with care. As he descended toward the yards, he felt something strange, intimate, undeniable. The sense that this woman, brilliant, fierce, wounded, was becoming important, dangerously important. And for someone whose recent life had been a procession of losses, that was as liberating as it was terrifying. Chapter 5. When walls begin to give way. Margaret had not expected him to defend her. The board meeting took place in the dark oak chamber her father had built decades earlier, grand enough to impress bankers, claustrophobic enough to crush any illusion of equality. 10 men sat at the table, all older, all convinced they knew more than she did, about railroads, about money, about the world, all conveniently forgetting that the one keeping the company alive was the woman standing before them. William sat in the back. Not to intervene, she had made that very clear, but to observe. He looked discreet, almost invisible. But Margaret knew better. Nothing in him slept. From his fitted sleeves to the small leather notebook in his hands, everything about him said he was here to witness every breath of that room. And somehow, that made the chamber less suffocating. But then Pierce began to speak, and the air thickened again. Jonathan Pierce, her largest shareholder after herself, face polished like an old coin and tongue sharp as a blade, cleared his throat with calculated theatrics. Miss Prescott, your Dakota projections are bold, ambitious to the point of recklessness. Margaret kept her posture straight. Her hand gripped a pencil, a little tighter than it should. Dakota is strategic. If we wait, Union Pacific will move north and box us in. That is speculation, Pierce countered, pushing his glasses up as though he'd uncovered an elementary error. No, she replied, controlled. It's projection based on field reports. Reports you interpreted, he emphasized with a slow, poisonous smile. The board might prefer an appearance of independence. After all, we all know you lack the territorial experience your father had. The blow landed precisely where he intended. And for the first time in that meeting, Margaret felt a flicker of something awful, a mix of anger and pain. Pierce saw it and pressed harder. Before we risk half of our available capital, he continued, spreading his thick hands over the table, we should consider whether the influence of your foreign consultant has affected your judgment. The room froze. Margaret went rigid. William lifted his head slightly. "Oh, what kind of influence are you implying?" she asked, voice too soft to be casual. Pierce smiled, the kind of smile that decays on the inside. "Oh, my dear, everyone knows a woman can be swayed, especially by someone with such urgent financial needs." The humiliation was thin, venomous, public, and then it happened. William closed his notebook, slowly, and stood. No sharp scrape of chair, no raised voice, just presence, and the entire room shifted. "Mr. Pierce," William said, calm as cold steel, "I believe that insinuation was directed at me. Allow me to respond." Pierce let out a short, mocking laugh. "You were invited only as an observer, Lord Hawthorne." "Then I observed," William replied, "and I've seen a glaring analytical error." Silence, the kind that precedes earthquakes. William walked to the table, impeccable, steady, without arrogance. There was a quiet aristocratic authority in him that even ruin had not erased, and when he chose to use it, it hushed any room. He set a stack of papers on the table. "I've spent 5 weeks reviewing every Prescott and Northern report," he said, "and I state with absolute conviction. The Dakota strategy is not reckless ambition. It is urgency. It is necessity. And if you allow the competition to advance, you will lose market position you will not recover in the next 18 months. Margaret felt something warm rise in her throat. No one had ever defended her ideas, much less with such precision. Pierce snapped, irritated. "And what does a duke know about American railroads?" William leaned forward, eyes fixed on his. "I know the cost of hesitation," he said. "I lost estates valued at £3 million because I listened to cowardly advice. Miss Prescott is doing exactly what I should have done, advancing while there is still ground to claim." The room went completely still. "And one more thing," William added. "Your argument against expansion is not prudence. It is fear disguised as wisdom." Pierce paled. Holbrook coughed, torn between shock and satisfaction. William lifted Margaret's calculations. "These numbers," he said, voice low but unbreakable, "are solid, coherent, precise. And if they had been written by a man, not one of you would have dismissed them this quickly." The room inhaled as though struck, Margaret too, because no one had ever dared speak aloud what she had known for years. The vote was cast, pressed, uneasy, tense. Approved, by a thin margin, but approved. When everyone finally left, only she and William remained. Margaret sat slowly. Her hand trembled, just enough for him to notice. "I didn't ask for your help," she said without looking at him. "I know. I don't need anyone to speak for me. I know." She lifted her face at last. "Then why did you do it?" William set his notebook away with quiet composure that belied the force of the moment. "Because you were right," he said simply. "And I won't watch mediocre men diminish your vision to protect their own pride." The sentence struck a place no one had ever reached. Something melted inside her, warm, unexpected, terrifying. "They'll say I'm influenced," she whispered. "They're saying it because they're afraid of losing control," William replied. "It doesn't make your ideas less true." She turned toward the window, where snow had begun to fall. "I hate this," she confessed. "I hate that the same words only matter when spoken by a man." William stepped closer. "Then let me use my weight while you need it," he said softly. "Not to speak for you, but to hold the door until you can walk through without me." Margaret looked at him. There was something new there. Something that wasn't just respect, something that pulled her closer and terrified her at once. 6 weeks, she murmured. 6 weeks until the end of our agreement. "I know. And after that?" He moved a step nearer, didn't touch her, but stood close enough for her to feel his warmth, his solid presence, that quiet steadiness he didn't seem aware he carried. "After that," William said, "we decide together. Not because a contract demands it, not because a title expects it, but because it might be worth choosing." Margaret held his gaze, and for the first time since George died, something inside her, small, timid, believed. She turned away to hide the tremor in her hands, but the damage was done. A wall had given way. She just didn't yet know how much. Chapter 6. The moment to retreat or advance. William had not expected her to come looking for him at night. The rented room he occupied, a narrow space above a tavern, with an improvised desk and the lingering scent of coal drifting in from the yards, always reminded him exactly where he stood in life, poised between a ruined past and an uncertain future. He worked by lamplight, suspenders loose, collar unbuttoned, reviewing notes for the next day. Snow tapped against the window in restless little clicks, like impatient fingers. Then came the knock. 3. Firm. Deliberate. He lifted his head, startled. No one sought him at that hour. When he opened the door, he needed a second to understand what he was seeing. Margaret Prescott stood there, snow caught in her hair, breath uneven, cheeks flushed from the cold. She wore a dark dress beneath a heavy winter cloak, yet she looked vulnerable in a way she never allowed inside the walls of her company. "May I come in?" she asked, without preamble. William stepped aside. "Of course. Is something wrong?" She entered, removed her cloak, glanced around the modest room, the narrow bed, the scattered papers, the trembling lamp, without a trace of judgment. But something heavy followed her inside. He felt it before she spoke. "Pierce came to my office after the meeting," she began, walking to the small window. "He said he'd buy my share of the company, spoke as though he were offering me relief." A sharp, humorless breath escaped her. Or rather, offering escape from a weakness. William's pulse quickened. Weakness? She turned, and what he saw was not the director. Not the armored woman he had been trying to decipher for weeks. It was Margaret, unshielded, unprotected. "You," she said. "He implied you were my weakness." The words shattered the air. William didn't move. "I see. And do you believe him?" "No," she answered immediately, then inhaled deeply. "But he'll plant that doubt in the board. He'll use your past against me. He'll say my judgment is compromised, that I'm too involved." She hesitated, then softer. "And perhaps I am." William stepped closer, one careful step. "Involved how?" She swallowed. Her eyes drifted away from his, an almost impossible sight. "When you defended me today," so she began, "when you spoke of my numbers as my work, when you faced Pierce with such certainty," she searched for words, breath quickening, "I felt protected." Her fist closed slowly. "And I don't know how to handle that, William, I don't." The air thickened, tense, hot, fragile. William drew a steady breath and stepped closer, though still not touching her. "That frightens you." "Terrifies me," she admitted, "because protection has a price. And because men protect only until they decide to leave." The truth struck him deep, but he didn't back away. "Margaret," he said softly, "may I be honest with you, without any veneer at all?" She gave a small nod. "I came to America a broken man. I sought a convenient arrangement. I wasn't looking for a future or a new life. Certainly not to feel anything." Her eyes flickered, barely, but undeniably. "But you changed that," he continued. And that frightens me every bit as much as it frightens you." She closed her eyes for a breath, allowing the truth to reach her. "Pierce is investigating you," she whispered. "Your past, your name, every scandal that's ever touched you. He said a ruined duke can't be a trustworthy partner for anyone." Her voice cracked, thin, unwilling, honest. "And I hated what I felt. I hated being afraid of losing you." Something inside William broke open. He stepped nearer. Not touching, yet close enough for her to feel his breath in the cold air. "Margaret," he murmured, "I'm here, and I'll stay as long as you want me to." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It glowed, it trembled, it waited. She lifted her face. "How can I believe that?" she asked, her voice shaking for the first time since he had known her. "How do I know you're not saying what I want to hear? How do I know you won't leave the moment the wind changes?" He raised his hand, slowly, giving her room to step away. She didn't. William touched her cheek with the lightest brush of his fingers, careful, reverent. "You can't know," he said. "And I can't know whether tomorrow you'll decide you deserve someone better than a man with debts and a hollow title." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "That's what trust is, a shared risk." Her breath stuttered. A single tear escaped, silent, rebellious, unexpected. William wiped it gently with his thumb. "You're not a weakness," he said. "You're a choice, the hardest and most honest one I've ever made." Margaret placed her hand on his chest, an almost unconscious gesture. "And if all this is a mistake," she whispered, "if we're not ready." He covered her hand with his own. "Then we face that mistake together," he said, "not because we must, because we choose to." She closed her eyes. 1 second. Then another, and then she gave in. Slowly, like someone stepping onto a fragile bridge, she rested her forehead against his chest. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, it was intimate, deep, almost sacred. William wrapped his arms around her, careful, unhurried, as if he held something precious that could shatter with too much force. He felt her finally breathe, a long, trembling breath, as though she had been holding air for years. They stayed like that. Two tired souls holding each other upright, without words, until she murmured against his chest, "I don't want to wait for the agreement to end." A heartbeat. "I already know what I want." William closed his eyes. The world stilled. "What do you want, Margaret?" She lifted her face, her dark eyes steady, unafraid. "You." The breath left him, not from shock but from relief, from long-suppressed longing, from life returning to him all at once. He leaned in, slowly, deliberately, his lips barely grazing hers. "And I want you," he whispered, "in every way that matters." When they kissed, it was slow, like a promise, not a hunger. A kiss that said, "I see you, I choose you, I stay." When they parted, both were breathless, but not because of the kiss, because of what they had surrendered, because of what they had chosen. "2 weeks left," she said. "I know. And what if someone sees us?" William smiled gently. "Then let them. We are not doing anything wrong." Margaret reached for her cloak, her hands still trembling. "I need to go back before anyone notices I'm gone." He placed the cloak around her shoulders, careful, intimate, protective. "Margaret." She paused at the doorway. William held her gaze. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, "even just a little." Her lips parted, searching for an answer, but no words came. She simply nodded and left. William closed the door and leaned against it, eyes shut, trying to steady his breath. 2 weeks. But for both of them, time had already lost its meaning. Something larger had begun. Chapter 7. When Fear Meets the Truth. Margaret had not expected that recognizing a feeling could be so quiet. There was no epiphany, no sudden spark. The feeling settled slowly, like the February snow covering Chicago, until the whole landscape changes, and no one can pinpoint the exact moment it happened. Winter was merciless that year. Rails froze, locomotives stalled, tempers snapped before dawn. Margaret spent entire mornings in the yards, snow clinging to her wool coat, fingers numb as she solved problems before anyone could even list them. And William was always there, not as a shadow, not as a protector, just present. He brought her hot coffee when he realized she hadn't eaten in hours. He took secondary meetings so she could handle emergencies. He worked beside her through long nights without demanding conversation, just sharing silence. And inside that constancy, something began to shift. One frigid night, close to 10, Margaret was reviewing contracts by lamplight. The wind pounded the windows, while the furnace spread a soft, uneven warmth through the room. She looked up instinctively and saw him. William, seated across the table, bent over cost reports, his brow furrowed, sleeves rolled, a loose strand of hair falling over one eye. The lamplight carved shadows along his face, an oddly beautiful blend of weariness and dignity. For a moment Margaret watched him openly, and a thought struck her with devastating clarity. I want this, exactly this. Not for 3 months, for a lifetime. The force of it stopped her hand mid-page. Her heart lurched, sharp and unmistakable. William noticed. He lifted his head, concerned. Margaret, are you well? Yes, she said too quickly, looking away. Just tired. But it wasn't fatigue. In the days that followed, she caught herself watching him in fragments. The way he greeted every worker by name. The way he saw solutions where others only saw problems. The way he treated everyone with unforced, effortless respect. William didn't pretend humility, and she feared and admired that in equal measure. The feeling became inevitable, and therefore terrifying. But the blow came from outside. It began with a discreet article, buried deep in the Chicago Tribune. Sources claim the heiress of a major railroad may be under the influence of a foreign aristocrat whose past raises questions. No names, no accusations, but enough to wound, to insinuate, to give shape to the very fear she fought to contain. Margaret crumpled the paper and threw it away, but the venom clung. At the morning meeting, she sensed whispers, side glances, a silence that hadn't existed before. In the afternoon, she found William in the yards, speaking with Sullivan about a brake issue. When he spotted her, his face lit with that brief smile, the one she tried to avoid and secretly waited for. And that hurt more than anything written in that newspaper. I need to speak with you, she said quietly, alone. William followed her to his small office, cramped but warm from the lamp. She closed the door, stood with her back to him, drew a long, steady breath. Pierce published something. Or rather planted something, she turned. They're insinuating you're influencing my decisions. William didn't look surprised. I saw it. Sullivan handed me the paper this morning. Then you know what it means. It means Pierce is afraid of your intelligence, William replied. And men like him strike exactly where it hurts. She clasped her hands. It's not just that. He's using you against me. Your past, your debts, the duel, the exile, everything. William breathed in, slow and deep. And you believe him? Margaret opened her mouth to say no, but the truth caught in her throat. She didn't believe, but she feared, and fear always took shortcuts. I don't know, she whispered. William stepped closer. Margaret, are you regretting this? Her eyes lifted at once, hurt, stung. No, she said. It's never hurt so much, but I'm not regretting it. Then why are you pulling back? I'm not. You are, he said gently. You're looking at me as if you're calculating the cost of losing me and the cost of letting me stay. Her breath hitched. I'm afraid, she said, and I hate what that fear does to me. William moved another step. Look at me. She did, with no strength left to look away. You're afraid I'll leave, he said, not accusing, simply understanding. The same way I'm afraid you'll realize you deserve better than a broken man. Tears stung her eyes, hot, stubborn, unwanted. Pierce said you're here for convenience, that if you had any chance of regaining your title, you'd run back to England without looking back. William closed his eyes for a heartbeat, as if struck by a quiet blow. "Then let me tell you something," he murmured. "Only once." He opened his eyes again. "I didn't come here looking for you, but I found you, and that changed everything." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to hold something overflowing. "William?" He touched her hand. "I'm staying," he said, "as long as you want me." A sob almost escaped her. She swallowed it down. And then it happened. Margaret stepped forward, then again, and slowly rested her forehead against his chest. Just like the first time she let herself bend, only now without hesitation. William wrapped his arms around her, eyes closing with the fierce tenderness of someone holding what he most feared losing. "I don't want to wait for the last 2 weeks," she murmured against him. "I already know the answer." William lifted her chin, guiding her gaze upward. "And what is it?" "I want you," she said, "and I want what could exist between us. Not because of a contract, not because of an agreement. I want it because it's true." The air warmed around them, dense, alive. William smiled, not with joy alone, but with the trembling relief of a man who has crossed his own fear. "I want you too," he said. He kissed her then, not hurried, not hungry, but certain. When they parted, their breath shook, not from the kiss, but from the courage behind it. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We keep going," William replied, "one step at a time." Margaret drew a long breath, and for the first time fear didn't paralyze her. Fear simply existed, and she existed beside him. Chapter 8. The gesture that changes everything. The letter arrived before dawn. William found it slid beneath the door of the small room he rented behind the rail yard. The messenger was long gone. Only the thin envelope remained, marked with the family crest. His chest tightened before he even broke the seal. He recognized Edmund's handwriting instantly. He read it once, then again. By the third time, the words seemed to beat like a pulse. The creditors accepted the proposal. If you return to England within 2 months and resume the administration, they will cancel a substantial portion of the debt. It's a rare offer. It would save the title, the land, and our sister's future. They require your permanent presence. William let the envelope fall onto the bed. The salvation he had chased for years was right there. Simple, direct, cruel. All he had to do was leave. But the thought that followed had a name. Margaret. He ran a hand over his face, breathing deeply as the city stirred awake. A distant whistle cut through the morning cold like an unavoidable summons. William rose and pulled on his coat with mechanical movements. There was no answer yet, not one he could live with. In the yards, the cold sliced like a blade. Workers raced through patches of ice, trying to keep the steam alive. Usually that routine steadied William, the order inside the chaos. But today everything felt heavier. That was when he saw Pierce leaving the administrative building. The man walked with long, self-satisfied strides, wearing the smug expression that always heralded poison. They crossed paths on the stairs. "Lord Hawthorne," Pierce said, tipping his hat, politeness as sharp as a fresh blade. "I dislike troubling you so early, but I have news." William straightened, ready for the blow. "Say it." "I've received rather interesting information about you." Pierce smiled. "A London court has scheduled a session to revisit certain irregularities involving the Hawthorne estate. March, I believe." William went still. "There is no such session." "Ah, perhaps my investigator was mistaken," Pierce replied lightly. "But you know how it goes. When there's smoke, shareholders assume fire." His eyes glittered. "And my only concern, of course, is Miss Prescott's reputation. One cannot build a future on unstable ground." William's blood burned. "Get out of my way." Pierce stepped aside, murmuring as he passed, "The past always returns, my lord. No one bets on shaky foundations." William strode inside, ready to confront him further. But when he reached the corridor leading to the main office, he stopped. Margaret had heard everything. She stood at the doorway, pale, the door still open behind her. "Is it true?" she asked, before he could speak. Is there an investigation against you? No, he said immediately. There isn't. He crossed the room. Margaret, look at me. This is something he invented. She closed her eyes briefly. But the rumor exists, and that's enough for the board to question my leadership. Pierce doesn't need to ruin you. He only needs to ruin my credibility. A crushing helplessness pressed on William's chest. Then let me fix it. I don't know if you can, she whispered, her voice cracking. Pierce thinks he's found my weakness. William stepped closer, slowly. And has he? Margaret opened her eyes. Fear flickered there. And something worse. You! The word fell between them like a bitter truth. She drew a breath, holding back something that wanted to break free. You defended me before the board. You've stood by me through everything. Of course, men like Pierce twist that into something improper. And you believe him? I don't, she said, but I'm afraid of what others will believe. William took her hands in his. Then call the board. Today. Now, I'll present documents that end this. I'll expose Pierce. I'll stand in the center if I must, so you never have to. She hesitated. Too long. Putting you at the center again would better me than you. At last, Margaret nodded. By 3 o'clock, the conference chamber buzzed with tense anticipation, the air thick with scandal and the hunger for spectacle. Margaret opened the meeting with a steady voice, though her fingers trembled on the page. William stood. He set his case on the table. Handed out documents, spoke with unshakable clarity. Official letters, English audit reports, legal attestations clearing the old inquest, proof of honest dealings with every creditor. Pierce interrupted twice, both times ignored. Holbrook cleared his throat. So, you have no pending litigation? None, William answered, and I can provide originals today. A murmur rippled through the room, half relief, half irritation at being manipulated by Pierce. William exhaled, but he wasn't done. There's something else, he said, pulling a different envelope from his coat. Margaret stared, confused. I received a letter from my brother this morning. His hands shook slightly as he opened it. The London creditors have offered a final settlement. They'll forgive most of the debt if I return and take up administration. They require me indefinitely. The shareholders leaned forward. Margaret did not move. It's a remarkable chance, William continued. The sort any man in my position would dream of taking. Pierce smiled, sharp, triumphant, sensing victory. William turned to Margaret. But when I opened that letter, I realized something. His voice softened, yet the entire room stilled. Everything pulling me back to England is past. Dead. He looked straight into her. You are future. Alive. Margaret felt the floor drop away beneath her. William stepped forward, pulling a small box from his coat. Pierce's face drained of color. And that is why, William said, opening the box, I make my choice now in front of everyone. The ring was simple, smooth gold, understated and honest, not a symbol of nobility, a symbol of intention. Margaret Prescott, he said, voice trembling but eyes steady. You've shown me strength, truth, courage, and even when you were afraid, you chose to stay. He drew a breath. I want to stay too, not out of need, not out of convenience, but because I love you. Silence. Complete. Absolute. Will you marry me, he asked. His head bowed just enough to make the words a vow, not a performance. Not for a contract, not for a title, but for us. Margaret lifted a hand to her mouth. Tears rose too fast to stop. She walked toward him. Slow, deliberate steps weighted with meaning. When she stood before him, she held his gaze with a strength rising from deep inside. Yes, she whispered, then clearer. Yes, I want that. Applause began hesitantly, then grew. Holbrook smiled. 2 board members stared, stunned. Pierce slipped out without meeting anyone's eyes. William slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling, not from doubt, but from relief. When the room finally emptied, only the 2 of them remained. Margaret cupped his face with both hands. You turned down your legacy for me, she murmured. Not for you, William corrected gently. For us. She smiled, broken and whole at once. I don't know what I've done to deserve this. You survived, he said softly, and you let me in. Margaret hovered there, between breath and promise. So, we begin now? She asked quietly. William rested his forehead against hers. Now. Outside, locomotives wailed through the ice. Chicago moved on, merciless, alive, relentless. But in that empty chamber, 2 lives finally found direction. Not toward the past, but toward everything waiting ahead. Together. Epilogue. What is built after? 8 months later, Margaret learned that happiness doesn't arrive with thunder. It settles quietly, like the soft June light slipping through the tall windows of the Prescott and Northern mezzanine, turning smoke and steel into something almost beautiful. Chicago kept growing without apology. Cranes cut through the sky, hammers echoed like heartbeats, locomotives breathed hot steam over the rails. The city hadn't slowed, but she had. Or perhaps for the first time, she finally had a place to rest. From the glass mezzanine, Margaret watched the rail yard as she had all her life. But now there was something different on the mahogany table. A second cup of coffee, a stack of notes in William's steady handwriting. A chair placed beside hers, not across from it, someone working with her, not against, a small detail. But for her, it meant everything. She scanned the yard until she found him. He was always easy to spot, sleeves rolled up, wholly focused, patient in a way few men ever were. William stood with Sullivan, studying the new signaling system that had begun as scribbles in George's notebook. Margaret's heart tightened, not with pain, but with something that felt like healing. George would have liked that man, he might even have trusted him before she did. The glass reflected her face back at her, still sober in dress, still steady in posture, but softened in ways she'd never allowed before. It wasn't surrender, it was peace, the kind that comes when walls are no longer necessary. The door opened behind her. You're studying the fleet as if it were some impossible riddle, William said as he approached. That usually means good news. Margaret smiled, a small, true smile. Did Sullivan approve the installation? With unusual enthusiasm, William laughed. He said if it works as well as George imagined, safety will increase like never before. Your brother was years ahead of his time. She nodded, and something warm eased through the air. William slipped his arms around her from behind, as natural as breathing. His beard brushed the top of her head as he rested his chin on her shoulder. He'd be proud, he murmured. Margaret held his arms. Not only of him, she said softly, of the man who chose to stay. William turned her gently to face him, his hands sure but tender. I've never regretted it, he said. Not for a single day. She studied him with that sharp, perceptive gaze she'd always had. Not even when the letters from England arrive? Not even then. He smiled, small, warm. Edmund finally understands that the past can't keep all of us prisoner. He's managing the estates. Better than I would, perhaps. Margaret gave a soft, amused breath. I don't believe that. Neither do I, he admitted, but it's good for him to think he can. She touched his jaw with her fingertips. The golden steadiness of his eyes still unraveled her in ways she'd never confessed to the board. William, thank you. For what? For staying. For choosing. For not breaking when things became difficult. He smiled against her palm. Margaret, I didn't stay out of courage. I stayed because for the first time in my life, there was something better to run toward than to run from. He pulled her closer. And that something was you. She rested her forehead against his, drawing a deep, steady breath. You know, the other day I realized I don't even know when I stopped being afraid. When was it? I'm not sure. It faded slowly, like ice under sunlight. She looked at him with the quiet certainty of a woman who has finally found her place in the world. When I noticed, it was simply gone. William traced her chin with his thumb, gentle and unhurried. Sometimes all we need is a hand outside the wall to remind us it can be opened. That's what you did, she whispered. You're the one who opened the gate, he said with quiet pride. Margaret took his hand, fingers intertwining with his. Outside, the yard breathed iron and steam. Late afternoon light washed the tracks in warm gold. Workers shouted orders, locomotives whistled, and life surged onward. Inside the mezzanine, the world was calm. "Shall we?" William asked. "Sullivan wants to show us something on the new control panel." "Let's go," she said. "But afterward, I want you to see the maps for the northern expansion. We need to decide together." "Together," he echoed, steady and sure. And as they walked side by side down the metal staircase, Margaret understood. Rebuilding wasn't returning to what was lost. It was creating what had never existed, with him, day by day, scar by scar, mile by mile. Sometimes, she realized, happiness smelled like warm steam, sounded like locomotives waking in the cold, and felt like William's hand closing around hers. And for the first time, she knew exactly where she was going.